The dining room at Renfield had been arranged the same way for 40 years, and everyone seated within it that evening understood the arrangement to be a kind of map. The Dowager Duchess sat at the head of the long table, where she had sat since before her son was old enough to carry a title of his own, and the guests of consequence were ranged outward from her in descending order of their usefulness to the house. Augusta sat where she had sat for 2 years of marriage, halfway down the left side, between a baronet's wife who spoke chiefly of her daughters and an elderly clergyman who did not speak at all. The candlelight pooled gold along the silver and the polished mahogany, and the talk moved easily, the way talk moves among people who have decided in advance that nothing of importance will be said. She set down her glass. She waited until the fish had been cleared and the next course not yet brought, that small suspended moment when the servants withdraw and the room belongs entirely to the people in it. Then she rose. There was nothing hurried in it. She did not push back her chair so that it scraped. She did not glance at her husband for permission, nor at the dowager for acknowledgement. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her gown with one hand, and began to walk the length of the table toward the head, past the baronet's wife, past the magistrate, past Lord Halewood and his silent daughter, every step of it in full view of people whose business it was to notice such things and to repeat them later in other drawing rooms. The dowager was still speaking when Augusta reached her. Something about the lateness of the spring. The sentence did not finish. It did not break either. It simply thinned into nothing, the way a thread thins before it parts, as the old woman registered that her daughter-in-law had not stopped at her shoulder to murmur some domestic question, but had continued past her to the empty chair at the very head of the table, the chair that no one had thought to set a place at, because no one had imagined it would be wanted, and had drawn it out and had sat down in it. No one moved. The clergyman blinked. The baronet's wife looked at her hands. Lord Halewood, who had spent 30 years in rooms where power changed hands quietly and had learned to recognize the moment when it did, looked at Augusta with the first genuine interest he had shown all evening. The dowager's face did not change. That was the thing Augusta had counted on, and the thing that told her she had judged the moment correctly. A woman who had built her entire authority on never appearing to exert it could not now exert it without confessing how much it had always cost her. To object would be to admit that the seat mattered. To rise and insist would be to make a scene, and the dowager had spent 40 years teaching everyone within her reach that scenes were what other, lesser women made. Her face did not change, but her hand, resting on the white cloth beside her glass, went very still, the fingers no longer toying with the stem, and Augusta saw it, and understood that the old woman had seen that she had seen it. At the foot of the table, for the Duke, by his mother's arrangement, had always been seated at the foot, a courtesy that looked like deference and functioned as exile. Vincent Esmond looked up. His wife was sitting at the head of his table. He had not known she meant to do it. He had a half-second in which he might have risen, might have gone to her, might have said something that would have turned the whole quiet act into a public declaration, a battle joined in front of witnesses. He did none of it. He turned back to the magistrate beside him and asked, in the same even tone he had been using all evening, whether the man had found the roads much improved since the new surveying. And the magistrate, after the smallest hesitation, answered him. That was all. That was the entire thing. The course came in. The footman, trained to see nothing, set the dishes down and saw nothing, though one of them, a young man named Pell, who had carried coal to Augusta's sitting room through the whole of a brutal winter 2 years before, allowed himself, in the instant before he withdrew, the ghost of a glance at the head of the table, and then a smaller, more private satisfaction that he was careful to take with him out of the room. To understand why a chair could matter so much, one would have had to understand the 2 years that had brought Augusta to it, and the years before, those that had made the chair into what it was. She had not come to Renfield as the sort of woman the house was built to receive. Her father was Josiah Price, and the Price fortune had been made in shipping, in tea and timber, and the long patient routes between Bristol and the far side of the world. And it was, by any measure that could be counted in pounds, an enormous fortune, larger than that of half the titled families who would not have received her father at their tables. But it had been made rather than inherited, and in the particular arithmetic of the ton, that single fact subtracted more than any sum could add: new money. The phrase followed her into every room. It was never said to her face, because the people who used it prided themselves on never saying anything to anyone's face. But she heard it the way one hears a draft in an old house, a cold that has no single source and is everywhere at once. She had married Vincent anyway, and she had married him knowing precisely what she was marrying into, because she had loved him and because he had loved her, and because she had never in her life been the sort of person who declined a thing merely on the grounds that it would be difficult. He had courted her in the face of every objection his mother could raise without raising her voice, and his mother could raise a great many. The dowager had not forbidden the match. Forbidding was crude. The dowager had simply made it understood through 100 small channels that the marriage was a misfortune born with grace, a debt the family had taken on to repair its roofs, and that Augusta herself was to be regarded as one regards a useful but regrettable arrangement, a drainage scheme, a profitable mortgage, the necessity of which one does not discuss at dinner. And the weapon she had chosen was precedence. It was, Augusta had come to understand, the most perfect weapon a woman of the dowager's generation possessed, because it was entirely invisible and entirely deniable and entirely devastating. The dowager never insulted her. The dowager was, in fact, unfailingly courteous in the way that a closed door is courteous. But at every dinner, Augusta was seated below her station. At every gathering, the dowager was deferred to first, consulted first, served first. When the ladies withdrew, it was the dowager who led them, and Augusta who followed somewhere in the middle of the line, behind women whose husbands ranked far below her own. In a world where every seat at every table announced precisely what a person was worth, Augusta was told meal after meal, season after season, that she was worth a place halfway down the table between the daughters and the silence. Vincent had wanted to end it. More than once, in the privacy of their rooms, he had told her he would speak to his mother, would simply instruct the household that the Duchess of Renfield was to be seated as the Duchess of Renfield, and have done with it. And each time, Augusta had asked him not to. Not because she did not feel it. She felt every inch of that long walk to her place each evening. But because she understood something about the nature of the thing being done to her that Vincent, who had been born into his rank and had never once had to think about whether he deserved his chair, could not entirely see. If he handed her the seat, it would be his seat, given to her, and the whole county would understand that the merchant's daughter sat at the head of the table because her husband had made them allow it. She did not want to be allowed. She wanted, in a manner that had no precedent and no manners to guide it, to be true. And a thing that is handed to you can always be taken back, whereas a thing you have made true by becoming it cannot. So she had spent 2 years becoming it. The winter of her first year had been a hard one, the hardest in living memory, the older tenants said, the frost so deep in the ground that the graves could not be dug, and the dead waited in the cold of the church porch for the thaw. The London ladies, when word reached them of the suffering on the northern estates, had done what London ladies did. They had written notes. Beautiful notes, full of sympathy, dispatched from warm rooms to the wives of stewards with instructions that something ought to be done. The dowager herself had composed several, and had read one aloud at breakfast in a voice of real feeling, and had then returned to her correspondence, having discharged, to her own satisfaction, the whole of her duty to the people freezing on her son's land. Augusta had gone to the steward. Tate had been steward at Renfield for 19 years, and in 19 years, no member of the family had ever come to him for anything but the rendering of accounts. He was a careful man, dry as a ledger, slow to warm and slower to trust, and he had braced himself. That first morning, the new Duchess appeared in the estate office for the usual thing. A great lady wanting to be told that the poor were being looked after so that she could feel that they were. Instead, she had sat down across the table from him, asked him for the rent rolls and the maps of the tenant farms, and proceeded to ask him questions he had been wanting someone to ask him for 19 years. Which families had children? Which had old people who would not last a hard frost? Where the wells froze first and where the chimneys drew badly? How much grain remained in the estate stores, and how it might be moved over roads that the snow had closed? She did not lift a sack of grain herself. She was not a fool, and she knew the difference between doing the work and seeing that the work was done. But she arranged it. Through Tate and through Mrs. Birch, the housekeeper, and through a network of carters and millers and farmers' wives that she built that winter out of nothing but attention and good sense, she saw to it that no family on Renfield land went without fuel or flour while the frost held. She sat up late in the small sitting room that caught the worst of the drafts, a single branch of candles burning low, going over Tate's lists by their light and her own. Which cottage had a sick child, which widow had no one to cut her wood, which of the outlying farms the carters could not reach until the lane was cleared, and how the clearing might be paid for. She learned the names. That was the thing the London ladies never troubled to do, and the thing the tenants never forgot. That the new Duchess, the merchant's daughter they had been prepared to resent, knew their names and the names of their children, and asked after the old people by name when the thaw finally came, and she rode out to see for herself that the lists had told her true. The cold got into the panes and frosted them white on the inside as well as the out, and still she sat, and the work got done, and the spring, when it came at last, found Renfield's people thinner and wearier than they had been, but every one of them alive. She did it without fuss and without announcement, and without a single note dispatched to London, and the tenants, who had their own arithmetic and did not trouble themselves over much with the question of old money or new, noticed that the grain came, and noticed who had sent it, and remembered. Tate noticed too. Somewhere in that winter, between the third week of frost and the first slow thaw, the dry, careful man had found himself, for the first time in 19 years, treated by a member of the family as a man whose knowledge mattered, and he had given his loyalty the way such men do, completely and silently and forever. Mrs. Birch, who had served the dowager faithfully for 30 years and had expected to dislike the merchant's daughter on principle, had instead found herself, by the second spring, defending Augusta in the servants' hall with a sharpness that surprised her. The respect that the drawing rooms of London withheld had been quietly assembling itself all that time below stairs and out across the fields, in the only places where respect cannot be arranged by a seating plan. None of this was visible at the dinner table. That was the cruelty of the dowager's chosen ground. A woman could be beloved of every soul on the estate, and it would not move her one place up the table, because the table did not measure love or competence or worth. It measured only precedence, and precedence answered to no one but itself. For 2 years Augusta had let it be so. She had walked to her place and taken it, and said nothing, and had let the county believe what the seating told them to believe, because she was waiting. Not for permission, and not for the right moment in the sense that a coward waits, hoping the moment will never come, but for the day when enough had become true beneath the surface that she could change the surface and have it hold. The night she walked to the head of the table was that day, and she had known it would be the moment she heard who was coming to dinner. For the principal guest that evening was Lord Hailwood, and Lord Hailwood was not merely a peer of long standing, but a man of real weight in the House of Lords, one of the small number whose good opinion could lift a younger lord's standing or quietly sink it. Vincent's own position there was still being made. He was conscientious and respected, and young enough that the older men were still deciding what they thought of him. An evening in which Hailwood went away well-disposed was worth a great deal. An evening in which he went away having witnessed the Duke of Renfield's household in disarray, the wife humiliated, the mother triumphant, the man at the foot of his own table unable to govern the women in it, was worth a great deal in the opposite direction. The dowager had understood this perfectly and had counted on it, for she had assumed, as she had assumed for 2 years, that Augusta would do nothing, because Augusta had always done nothing, and that the dinner would proceed as all the others had, with the merchant's daughter in her proper place and the proper order of the world on display for the great man to admire. She had made, in the whole of her long and careful campaign, exactly one error, and it was the error of believing that silence is the same thing as submission. Augusta had been silent for 2 years. She had not, for one single day of them, submitted. The course was served. The talk resumed, though it had a new quality now, an attentiveness, the guests aware that something had occurred, and uncertain what it had been or what it meant, and listening, therefore, with a sharpness that the evening had not previously possessed. The dowager spoke pleasantly of the spring and the roads and a wedding in a neighboring county, and her voice did not waver, and only Augusta, watching her with the particular attention of a woman who had studied her adversary for 2 years, could see what the effort of that steadiness was costing her. The hand on the cloth had not moved. It was Lord Halewood who turned the evening, though he did not know he was doing it. He was a practical man, impatient of ornament, and he had come north in part to satisfy himself about a question of drainage, a scheme of land improvement on a neighboring estate that touched on matters then before the Lords, and on which he wished for the opinion of someone who actually managed land rather than merely owned it. He had meant to put the question to the Duke, but the Duke was at the foot of the table, and the conversation had drifted, and the question was a practical one, and Lord Halewood was a man who put his questions to whoever seemed most likely to answer them. He turned, therefore, to the lady at the head of the table, she being, by the plain logic of where she sat, the person to whom such a question would naturally be addressed, and asked her what she made of the new methods of drainage, whether she thought the expense justified by the yield, and how such a scheme might be managed across tenancies that did not all wish to share the cost. And Augusta answered him. She answered him well. She had spent 2 years in Tate's office with the maps and the rent rolls. She knew the land of Renfield as few of its owners had ever known it, knew which fields flooded and which held the wet through summer, and what it had cost to bring a particular meadow into good heart. She did not lecture, and she did not perform. She spoke as one practical person to another, with figures where figures were wanted and judgment where judgment was, and Lord Halewood, who had expected at best a graceful evasion, leaned forward over his plate and engaged with her, and the two of them fell into precisely the kind of substantial conversation that the whole elaborate machinery of the dinner had been designed to prevent. He pressed her on a point, and she met it. She raised an objection he had not considered, and he conceded it with the frank pleasure of a man who has found, unexpectedly, someone worth talking to. Once he laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh at something dry she had said about the reluctance of tenants to pay for improvements they had not thought of themselves, and the sound of it carried down the table, and several of the guests turned and saw the great man from London laughing with delight at something the Duchess of Renfield had said, and revised in that instant, and without quite noticing they did it, 2 years of carefully maintained opinion. The Dowager had no part in it. This was the thing. For 40 years she had governed every table she sat at by the simple mechanism of her position at the head of it, the place to which all conversation naturally flowed, from which all conversation could be redirected, the seat of the hostess, the center toward which the whole room oriented itself as a compass orients toward the north. From that seat she could draw any topic back to herself, could deflect any question, could with a single remark dissolve a conversation she did not like and conjure another she preferred. It had never looked like power. It had looked like graciousness. But it had been power the whole time, and it had depended utterly on her occupying that one chair. She was no longer in that chair. She was 3 places down it, an honored guest in what had been, an hour before, indisputably her own room, and from 3 places down there was nothing she could do. She could not draw the conversation back. It had a new center now, and the center was not her. She could not object to the merchant's daughter discussing drainage with a peer of the realm, because there was nothing to object to. The lady of the house was speaking with a guest about the management of the estate, which was the most natural thing in the world, and only became unnatural if one insisted on remembering that the lady of the house was supposed to be someone else. The Dowager sat very straight in her chair, and she listened to her daughter-in-law command the attention of the most important man at the table, and her face, which had not changed when Augusta first sat down, did not change now, and the not changing of it was the only sound the war ever made. Vincent watched it from the foot of the table. He had spent 2 years in a quiet agony over this, torn between the wife he loved and the mother he could not bring himself to wound, telling himself that keeping the peace was a kind of kindness when he had known, in the part of himself that did not lie, that it was only ever a kind of cowardice dressed in better clothes. He had wanted to fix it for her. That was the shape his love had taken, and it had been, though he had not understood this until precisely this evening, the wrong shape. Because to fix it for her would have been to do to her, gently, the very thing his mother did to her cruelly, to treat her as a person whose place had to be arranged by someone else. He understood now, watching her, that the only thing she had ever needed from him was the thing he was doing at this moment, which was nothing. To sit at the foot of his own table and let her hold the head of it, to answer the magistrate about the roads and let the room reorganize itself around her without his hand visible anywhere in it. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and it looked, from the outside, like no action at all, and that was exactly why it was the right one. The dinner ended, as dinners do. The ladies withdrew, and this time it was Augusta who rose first and led them, not by any announcement but by the simple gravity of where she had been sitting, and the dowager, who could have made a stand here, who could have sailed to the door ahead of her daughter-in-law and forced the issue at last, did not. She rose with the others. She followed. She did it with her chin level and her step unhurried and as much dignity as the circumstances would allow her, which was, to her credit, a considerable amount. For whatever else might be said of the Dowager Duchess of Renfield, she was not a woman who wept or raged or clung. She was a woman who understood, better than anyone in that house, the precise meaning of a procession, and she understood that she was now walking in the middle of one. She did not surrender the field that night, or the next day, or all at once. That was not her way, and Augusta would not have respected it if it had been. There was a period, some weeks, in which the old patterns tried to reassert themselves, in which the dowager's voice in the morning room was a degree colder, and her remarks at dinner carried a fraction more edge. Small skirmishes fought along a line that had already, though neither woman said so, been decided. But the thing about precedence is that it is brittle. It holds enormous weight so long as no one tests it, and it shatters the instant someone does and is not stopped. Augusta had tested it in front of Lord Halewood and the magistrate and half the county's appetite for gossip, and no one had stopped her, and so it had shattered, and there was no mending a thing like that back into the shape of law. Within the season, the seating at Renfield had simply rearranged itself around the new truth, the way water finds its level once the dam is gone, and the head of the table was Augusta's, and no one any longer remembered to find it strange. The dowager's influence did not so much end as recede, like a tide going out so gradually that one looks up one afternoon to find the water unaccountably far away. She was not banished. Augusta took particular and deliberate care that she should not be, partly from a genuine kindness and partly from a clear-eyed understanding that a defeated enemy treated with grace becomes, over time, something less dangerous than a defeated enemy nursing a wound. The dowager kept her rooms, her household, her standing as the mother of the duke. She was consulted, where consultation cost nothing and gave pleasure. She was seated at the great occasions in the place of high honor that was properly hers, though it was no longer the head of the table, and both women knew it, and neither remarked on it. What she lost was not her dignity but her dominion, and she lost it not to an act of cruelty, but to the simple fact of a younger woman who had made herself indispensable to everything the house actually was, while the older woman had been guarding the one position from which indispensability could be denied. For Augusta, the change that mattered most was not the seat itself. The seat was only the visible sign of it. What changed was that the long fiction under which she had lived for 2 years, that she was provisional, tolerated, a useful arrangement to be endured rather than a duchess to be reckoned with, was over, and could not be revived because the whole county had watched it end and had watched no one prevent the ending. She was, from that night, simply the Duchess of Renfield, in the eyes of the ton, as she had long been in the eyes of every soul who worked the land. The drawing rooms of London, which respect almost nothing but respect accomplished fact above all things, adjusted their opinion of her with the speed of people who do not wish to be caught having held the wrong one, and discovered, to their general surprise, that they had always thought rather well of her. Lord Halewood went away well-disposed, more than well-disposed. He went away having decided that the Duke of Renfield, whatever the irregularity of his marriage, had had the great good sense to marry a woman of uncommon ability, and that a man with such judgment in his own house was a man whose judgment might be trusted in the Lord's. Vincent's standing, which his mother had thought to protect by the old arrangements, was in fact made by the new one, and was made by the very thing the dowager had spent 2 years trying to prevent. There was a justice in that which Augusta, who had not planned it and could not have, found quietly satisfying for the rest of her life. She and Vincent spoke of it only once, that same night, when the guests had gone and the house was dark, and they were alone at last in the room that was wholly theirs. He had taken her hand and said simply that he was sorry. Sorry for the 2 years. Sorry for every dinner he had let her walk down the length of that table. Sorry that he had thought keeping the peace was a thing worth more than her dignity. And she had told him that he had nothing to be sorry for because he had given her that evening the only thing she had ever wanted from him, which was the room to do it herself. He had not handed her the seat. He had not made them give it to her. He had simply trusted her to take it and had stood by and had let it be hers. She told him that a place handed over can be taken back, but a place taken can only be lost, and she had no intention of losing it. He had laughed at that, low in the dark, and had said that he pitied any soul foolish enough to try and take it from her, and they had said no more about it because there was no more to say. The war was over. It had been fought from first shot to last without a single voice being raised, and it had been won by the woman who understood that the loudest thing in any room is very often the person who is chosen, deliberately and at length, to say nothing at all. The years that followed were good ones, and they were good in the way that the best years are, which is to say largely without incident. The slow accumulating contentment of a house well run and a marriage well made and a piece of land brought, season by season, into better heart than it had known in a generation. There was an heir in time, a boy, robust and loud, who would one day be Duke of Renfield and who showed, even very young, a disconcerting tendency to walk into rooms as though he owned them, which his father said he had got from his mother and his mother said he had got from nobody. She had no idea what he meant, and which the dowager, watching the child stump across the morning room to seize the chair he wanted, observed with an expression that was almost, in the failing light, a smile. For the dowager found, in the role reduced but not erased, a peace she had not expected and would never have admitted to having sought. There is a particular exhaustion in spending 40 years holding a position by force of will, in measuring every seat at every table, in never once being able to relax the vigilance on which one's whole authority depends. And when the position was gone, and the vigilance no longer needed, what was left underneath it was an old woman who was, it turned out, rather tired and rather fond of her grandson, and not entirely sorry to set down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was heavy. She and Augusta arrived over those years at something that was not warmth and was certainly not friendship, but was a kind of mutual recognition, two formidable women who had fought each other to a standstill and had each, in the fighting, come to understand the other's quality. The dowager never apologized. Augusta never asked her to. But there came an evening, years on, when the dowager, rising from dinner, paused a moment by the head of the table where Augusta sat, and rested one hand briefly on the back of the chair, and said nothing at all, and went on, and Augusta understood it for what it was, and let it be enough, because it was. Augusta sat at the head of the table for the rest of her life. By the end she did it without thinking about it, the way one breathes, the way a thing becomes simply and unremarkably true once enough time has passed since the moment it was claimed, until there were people at her table, young people who had never known it had ever been otherwise, who could not have imagined the merchant's daughter walking the long length of that room under the eyes of the county, because to them she had always been there, had always belonged there, was the fixed point around which the whole house turned and always had been. And that, in the end, was the victory. Not the night she took the seat, dramatic as it was, but the slow years afterward in which the taking was forgotten and only the truth of it remained, polished by use into something no one questioned because no one could any longer remember a time when it had not been so. There's a kind of strength that announces itself, and there's a kind that does not, and the world is forever mistaking the first for the second. We are taught to expect that the wronged will raise their voices, that justice arrives loud, that the moment of triumph is the moment of the great speech, the cutting word, the enemy laid low in front of witnesses. But the deepest victories are often the quietest. They are won not in a single shout, but in 1,000 silent mornings of doing the work no one will see, of becoming indispensable in the dark, of waiting, not weakly, but with terrible patience, for the day when enough has become true beneath the surface that one can change the surface and have it hold. Augusta Price did not raise her voice once in 2 years. She simply made herself impossible to do without, and then, one ordinary evening, she stood up and walked to the place that the doing without had earned her, and sat down, and let the silence do the rest. The chair had never been given to her. That was the whole of its meaning. She had made it hers by sitting in it, and a thing made true that way stays true long after the people who once thought to deny it have forgotten they ever did. Stories like hers are not loud, and they do not end with a thunderclap. They end with a woman at the head of a table, perfectly at ease, in a house that has quietly rearranged its whole understanding of the world around the simple, unanswerable fact of her. If you have ever held your peace through a long wrong, not from weakness, but because you understood that some things must be earned rather than granted, and waited for the day you could make the truth of yourself plain, then perhaps this story was always meant to find you. They arrive here, like a chair claimed in full view and never once surrendered whenever they are ready.